And good evening. Welcome to another edition of The Family Tree. My name is Sylvester Rivers, and our guest this evening is attorney Chokwe Lumumba. And you might remember Chokwe because of the recent Brinks robbery. He was the attorney for Fulani Sunni Ali. And Mr. Lumumba is also the Minister of Justice for the Republic of New Africa, RNA. He's also the Chief Counsel to the Committee to Defend the New African Freedom Fighters. Welcome to KPFK.
I'm happy to be here, brother.
We'll start out by talking a little bit about this Brinks robbery that's fresh in our mind, and basically the impression I got was one of injustice because you were the attorney for Sister Fulani Sunni Ali, and they said, well, you couldn't be the attorney because you were a member of the Republic of New Africa.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that was what happened in this case, which is pretty much reflective of a lot of the other developments that even happened before I got in the case. But I did go to New York where I was representing Sister Fulani, and when I got there, they indicated that I was a citizen of the Republic of New Africa. Of course, they said a member, and I'll explain that in a minute. I was also a worker for the provisional government of the Republic of New Africa, an officer, and they said I was a terrorist, and I was going to use the courtroom as a political platform. What it was, I think that they were afraid of, is that I was a person who was versed in the New African independence movement in America. I was versed with the fact that African people in this country, or black people in this country, do constitute a nation, and that we certainly have a right to be independent like any other nation, and I was fully committed to those ends. And I guess they sensed that in my presence in the case, those issues were clearly going to be raised. And so what they attempted to do is to forestall that by declaring myself a terrorist and suggesting that the provisional government of the Republic of New Africa was a terrorist entity, when in fact we have operated openly and above ground and participated in absolutely no terrorist activities during our 14-year history. Let me say this, Brother Sylvester, because I think this will help us start at the right point as we talk about the Brinks incident. Actually, they called it a robbery. We don't go along with that. What we say is that the Brinks incident is an expropriation attempt. In order to understand that clearly, we have to understand a thing that was put out called the Black Liberation Army communique. It was a communique put out by what we consider to be, and what around this country is considered to be, one of the underground apparatuses of the Black Liberation Movement. The Black Liberation Movement is that movement which is fighting for the freedom and liberation of black people in this country. But the Black Liberation Movement is a group of brothers and sisters who evolved apparently out of the Panther Party originally, and they evolved out of the Panther Party because at the time the COINTELPRO program, the United States government, was waging war on the Black Liberation Movement and literally killing Panthers like Fred Hampton, and incarcerating Panthers. And the things that the Panther Party was attempting to do openly and even in accordance with the United States laws, it became very difficult for them to do. And so they said that if the laws won't let us fight for our freedom of our people, then we're going to have to fight for the freedom of our people despite the laws. And so what they did is they took up an option which the United Nations says that oppressed people have. And what the United Nations says is that oppressed people have a right to armed struggle. And that's not really a unique concept. Even the United States Declaration of Independence speaks to that. So the Black Liberation Army, throughout the early part of the 70s, participated in the war against the system of the United States, against police officers who killed black people in the street, against banks who helped rob all of us blind, against dope houses in particular, which helped to pump chemicals into the bloodstream of our youth. And they, in this war against our oppressors, began to be hunted by the United States FBI, the CIA, and various other forces. The Black Liberation Army, in 1973, a number of the persons in it went to jail. But in 1979, a key feature in the resurrection of the Black Liberation Army was that a sister by the name of Assata Shakur, some call her Joanna Chesimard, who the authorities said was the soul of the Black Liberation Army. Well, this sister went to jail for about 5 or 6 years. In 1979, the Black Liberation Army came into jail and liberated her. They took her out of jail, which was certainly a mark in the rise of the movement. Apparently, during this entire period, during the 70s, the Liberation Army was also paying very close attention to the physical atrocities, the genocidal type activities which were occurring to our people. They noted that in Buffalo, black men were having their hearts cut from their chests. They noted that in Boston, Massachusetts, something like 14 black women had mysteriously disappeared and were killed. They certainly noted the Atlanta situation where our children were being murdered. They noted the Guyana situation where now we find that the CIA tied to the death of over 800 black people and some other folks under the Jim Jones thing. What they felt was necessary was a thorough investigation of this matter. So they formed what was called the Revolutionary Armed Task Force, which consists of Black Liberation Army members, and the Black Liberation Army is an all-black army, but it consists of Black Liberation Army members, and they recruited some inactive white people who had perhaps been in various other white organizations which had supported black self-determination and black liberation. And they put these white people into the Revolutionary Armed Task Force, and through them infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan, the Moral Majority, and various other groups. And they found out that right-wing groups were very much hooked up with the FBI, and that they were keyed into capitalist finance in the country, that they were being fed generously money from persons like John Connolly and from various other very rich people in the country. Upon discovering this, they were concerned that black people were disarmed, disorganized, and certainly suffering from all types of economically and socially destabilizing conditions, which were preventing us to organize, to defend ourselves against the things which were continuously occurring. Without going into a long dialogue on all the things that were continuously occurring, let me say that John Conyers, who's a representative from the city of Detroit, a black representative from the city of Detroit, has filed with the United States Congress a list of something over 100 different racialistic murders and abuses which have occurred to black people over the last 3 years. Now, we're not talking about the last 10 years or 20 years, but the last 3 or 4 years. And so the Black Liberation Army felt it was necessary to prepare black people against it. So what they did is that they launched an activity to take money, which would be necessary to defend the black community, to feed into black educational institutions and various other things, to bring our youth out of this system of education which does not prepare them to learn anything or prepare them to live, but in fact prepares them to die. And so they felt it was necessary to raise money for all these things. And so the way that they went to get the money was by taking the money from the same capitalistic dogs who took it from us in various different ways. So the Brinks car, which in Brinks, of course, is very much in tune with capitalism in this country, very much on top of it, very much in it, was an incident which occurred in Nyack, New York on October the 20th, 1981. The Black Liberation Army, along with apparently members from the Revolutionary Armed Task Force, stopped the Brinks car. They took money out of the car, and as the guards attempted to shoot them, they shot the guards, right? One guard was killed. I think another was wounded. And later on, police officers attempted to stop and shoot them, and 2 police officers were killed in the process of this. And so that's actually what occurred in the incident. Immediately after the incident, they arrested one brother by the name of Sam Brown, who is a conscious participant in the Black Liberation Movement for over a number of years. And they arrested 3 white people by the name of David Gilbert, Catherine Bodine, and Judith Clark, whose records have shown them to be supporters of the Black Liberation Movement for a number of years. They claim that this was an act of the Weather Underground, but as far as we can ascertain, there's no such thing as the Weather Underground at this time. These persons were arrested. Samuel Brown was taken to jail. He was beaten. He was beaten to the point where they fractured the bones in his neck. He was taken to the hospital, stayed there for 2 days, brought him out, and then beat him again. Police officers actually stood on his head and jumped up and down on his head. They tortured him for a number of months, and for 4 months we said he needed medical attention, and they told us he didn't. They refused to let me visit him, too. But at the same time that they refused to let me visit him, they had the FBI visiting him, slapping him around and attempting to get information out of him about the Black Liberation Army. Samuel Brown, 4 months later, was examined by a doctor who told us his neck was broken, or he had fractures in his neck. He was operated on in a hospital, and we believe that there was perhaps malpractice in the operation because of the way that they entered into the operation and the way that they shipped him right back to prison almost immediately after the operation. 3 days after the October the 20th incident, a brother by the name of Umtahari Shabaka Sundiata and another brother by the name of Sekou Odinga were stopped, and they were riding in Queens. That's Queens, New York. They were riding a car which belonged to a sister by the name of Yasmin Fula. As they were stopped, they both attempted to avoid the police, who were in fact shooting at them at the time they stopped them. Sekou Odinga went one way and Umtahari went the other way. Umtahari attempted to climb a fence, and as he was climbing a fence, he was shot in the back. He fell to the ground, and police officers stood over him and shot him in his face, killing him on top of a garbage heap. They left him there for the TV cameras to take his picture so they could show it across the city and across the country, more or less as a message to black people. And these pictures that they took show police officers standing over Umtahari like proud hunters who had captured their game. Brother Sekou Odinga was arrested and was not killed, but he was taken to jail and he was beaten to the point where his pancreas had been virtually destroyed. He had to be fed intravenously in a hospital for several months, many months, until just recently, really. He also encountered a torturing by cigarette burns. They took cigarettes and they burned him all over his body. This is a thing that the Israelis do to the Arabs. And they do it, of course, because they learned it from the CIA of the United States. So it's back home, so to speak. And they did it to Sekou. And then they put the brother's head in the toilet, and they flushed his head in the toilet. And Sekou did survive this. His head was all bloated up in the paper and things of this nature. At this time, he's in reasonably decent health, but he's still having, obviously, stomach problems because of the pancreas injuries. Later on, they arrested a brother named Abdul Majid in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia police jumped on him and gave him 42 stitches to his head. We're not even sure that they knew who Abdul Majid was. Abdul Majid is alleged to have been involved in the Brinks incident. It's our information that that's not true, that he is absolutely not involved. He's alleged to be a member of the Black Liberation Army. But we don't even think that the Philadelphia police was necessarily aware of this. They may have been or may not have been, because they in Philadelphia say they beat black people with tremendous recidivism all the time, with frequency all the time. So in any event, he got 42 stitches to his head, and then after he was that they took him to New York. Fulani Suni Ali is an officer of the Republic of New Africa. She's the vice chairperson at this time of the People's Center Council, which is our head body, the head decision-making body in the provisional government. She, at the time of her arrest on October the 27th, 1981, was actually the chairperson of that body called the People's Center Council. She has a long history in the movement. She's been in the movement maybe 10 to 12, 13 years. She used to be a Black Panther at one time herself. She sung around the world with Mariam Makeba. She has absolutely no criminal record whatsoever. She's the mother of 5 children, and she's an emergency medical technician. And she's a teacher. She teaches young black children in Republic of New Africa schools and in a camp that we have in Mississippi from time to time. What happened on October 27th is that the FBI brought 200 men, 4 tanks, 2 helicopters, machine guns, and various other weapons of war to a little farmhouse in Birdtown, Mississippi. They call it Gallman. We call it Birdtown because the town was actually named after a black man named Bird. And since they didn't like that, they have now renamed it Gallman. But in any event, Fulani was surrounded by these people. She was inside the house asleep. It was at 6:30 in the morning. Inside that house was Fulani, another sister, about 31 years old. Fulani's about 30. 3 of Fulani's 5 children were in the house. 8 of Jerry Gaines' children were in the house, and Jerry Gaines was the other sister in the house. And a brother named Alajo Adebeloa, who's the father of Fulani and the grandfather of many of the children. He was in the house. And then one other child was in the house that I think belonged to a neighbor. They surrounded the house and they marched all the people out of the house, including the children. They handcuffed Fulani, they handcuffed Jerry and Alajo, and they even handcuffed the children. These children were from 9 months to 12 years old. They handcuffed all of them except a few babies who they said they couldn't find handcuffs small enough to fit. And with those, they grabbed them and held them tight to their chest so they couldn't do anything to them, right? This was a brave group of 200 FBI agents, and as they made these children walk, the ones who could walk, one by one, without their mothers or their grandfathers, they refused to let them walk with their belts, and they made them walk past the tanks, and that's how they marched people out past the tanks. The tanks were in combat-ready position, in other words, ready to fire and destroy the house and all the human beings in it. Fortunately, Elijah was able to dart out, out of the house before they had a chance to fire, and they did not open fire on him or on the house. Now, this situation occurred. They called Sister Fulani a terrorist across the country. They called the provisional government a terrorist organization. They said that she had planned the Brinks incident. 3 weeks later, that she was released. She was released because we proved beyond a reasonable doubt that she was in New Orleans at the time that the incident occurred on October the 20th and the 21st. And we also demonstrated that they should have known where she was because they claimed they had been surveilling her for 4 months prior to the time of the incident. The fact that they were surveilling her should take no one by great surprise. They have been surveilling the Black Liberation Movement and the Provisional Government of the Republic of Africa for a great many years, something like since we were started in 1968. In fact, we found out in 1971 that they had actually surveilled us for about 10 times the amount of time that they were supposed to have addressed to the Ku Klux Klan in the state. And that's the year that a number of black people were murdered by the Klan inside of Mississippi. But returning to the Brinks incident of 1981, Fulani was arrested. She went to New York. They did deny me the right to represent her, denied me the right to visit many of the other people. They had to back down on that when we had appealed that denial, and when they realized that actually what they were doing was creating some problems for themselves. Lawyers tended to come to my support. I am a person who has performed as a lawyer since 1975, and I really don't have the type of problems that many other lawyers have. And if they can bar me for my political beliefs, then I think a lot of lawyers were concerned about the reasons why they could get barred from practicing. And so for that reason, they began to respond. Even some conservative members of the bar even began to respond. In addition to that, people began to raise some questions about it. And I think that their fascism was being shown very nakedly to people. And for that reason, they did, in fact, lift that ban. Another reason they lifted it is because we had begun to use it strategically. All of the brothers and sisters who were arrested asked me to represent them. And so I said, yeah, I would represent all of them, which meant that for them to deny me to represent them was to deny all of them representation, which meant that even after the trial and they were convicted, they would have appellate issues which could perhaps prevail in the end. So the prosecution caught wind of what we were doing, I suppose, and what they did is they lifted the order which denied me the opportunity to represent them. But that's just one feature of a very, very extensive case. I think that whenever they stick tanks in the face of our babies, then we know that we have a problem here which is more extensive than just the mere denial of rights of a council or a constitutional problem or civil libertarian problem. We have the question of a war which is being launched upon black people in this country. And that's when we find ourselves at the Brinks incident. The Black Liberation Army, in response to a war which had already begun. The Black Liberation Army didn't start the war on the 20th, but in response to a war which had been done by brutal police officers and various other military agencies of the United States government, which has killed our people from coast to coast and border to border. Mule love here, round settles there, and so on and so forth. This situation was responded to on the 20th. The police, failing to find the real soldiers involved, began to launch a search and destroy mission against the civilian and the political population and perhaps some other soldiers who were not involved. And this is where we are right now. We are preparing for long, arduous legal proceedings in New York, and we are organizing around the country. But the warfare is a question which must be raised, not only in New York, but around the country.
Before we start talking about warfare in America, which I think you spoke on this weekend, why is the Republic of New Africa linked with the Brinks expropriation?
Well, see, failing to have any evidence, what they begin to do is to use politics to provide them links. In other words, the Black Liberation Army is an army which speaks toward the question of independence for black people in this country. You know, they want land and independence. The provisional government of the Republic of New Africa in our time, in the last 10 to 12, 14 years, has been the leading force in the movement for land and independence for black people, specific land and independence for black people. The provisional government of the Republic of Africa says that black people are a nation. It's not like making a nation. We already are. And that what we have to do is to get some land in order to manifest the independence of that nation on. The concern that we have is for liberation of land in the southeastern portion of the country, in the states of Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, and in Alabama. And the provisional government, having that type of political framework, is kindred in its beliefs to the Black Liberation Army. The provisional government works in different ways than the Black Liberation Army does. It's necessary in this struggle that we have people that organize people above ground, and that's what the provisional government does. The Black Liberation Army is at war. You know, they're responding to the war which has been put upon us. And for that reason, they organize military operations, which they fight the oppressor with underground. The provisional government, of course, has defensive apparatuses which have been used before in order to defend ourselves against people who attack us, but at the same time is not involved in military operations of any kind offensively. And so what happened is that they felt that since they couldn't find the people who apparently were involved, that they would help sensationalize the event by going to a small farmhouse in Mississippi, putting out 200 troops and bringing TV cameras. By the way, when they arrested the Fulani, they had TV cameras there already. And by arresting her and telling white folks essentially across the country that this was a deed done by devious black folks who want to take some land, you know, in this country. And that was essentially their way of tarnishing the movement, and by trying to present the political images in a degrading manner. And so that's why the provisional government got caught up in it. We, however, felt that if the Black Liberation Army was in it, we're in it anyway. They are, in fact, sisters and brothers of the same struggle. We do recognize them. We honor them. We look at them in 1982 the same way as we look at Harriet Tubman and various other persons who fought historically. We don't think we should wait 100 years to recognize that they're freedom fighters, like we have with Harriet and other people.
Seems like it's obvious then that this was a political move. The reason why. Were there any other groups that the government?
Yeah, they touched a number of groups. They touched Sonia Sanchez in Philadelphia. They went down and harassed her. And she is affiliated with the Black United Front of Philadelphia. She's also a poetress. You know, Sonia Sanchez is a famous black poetress. Sonia is also affiliated with New African Women's Organizations, I know. They also touched the National Task Force for Counterintelligence Research and Litigation and Research. This was an organization that was put together by a combination of black groups. And the purpose of this group was to investigate the FBI and to find the files where they had illegally surveilled, illegally framed, and the files where they had illegally surveilled, illegally framed, and illegally tampered with other Black liberation groups, and to sue them. And they arrested Sister Yasmin Fula, who is the secretary of the task force, and they tried to make her testify in front of the grand jury, and she refused to testify, and so she has been put in jail. As a matter of fact, she was put in jail, she won her appeal, and she's out of jail, and now she was supposed to go back before the grand jury today. I have not checked with New York yet, I'm not sure, but my belief is that they will try to put her back in jail. And so these were the groups that were touched directly. They literally put hundreds of FBI agents into the street to harass a number of different groups, the National Black Human Rights Coalition, and various other persons who support these movements. The sister that was arrested in the house with Fulani, Sister Jerry Gaines, who has 8 children, who has not the most remotest connection with either the incident in New York, or doesn't really even know more than 2 or 3 people in New York, I'd be willing to suggest. They have now put her in jail because she refused to testify in front of the grand jury. She stated to them that she felt that what the grand jury was doing was attempting to destroy the Black liberation movement. That was not only a violation of black people's right to freedom, but she's a very religious woman, and she stated to them that she felt it was a violation of God's law. And so this is what they are doing. They are attacking not only Black Liberation Army soldiers where they can find them, and political people where they can find them. They're attacking our good sisters, and they're attacking the children, you know, by attacking the sisters and by attacking the movement, very directly attacking the children. And so it is our position, of course, that they are the real terrorists. We don't know of any kind when the Black Liberation Army has ever stuck guns in the face of babies. Right? So of of any time when the Black Liberation Army has ever tortured anybody by burning them with cigarette burns or flushing anybody's head in the toilet stool or beating somebody into the point where their neck is broken. We don't think that they do that. And so that being the case, we'd have to identify the terrorists where we find them, and we think that they come from the White House, they come from the FBI, they come from the military and economic establishment in the United States.
We both agreed that it was a political type move. I want to clarify that a little bit. To me, for instance, I heard on the media, newspapers, etc., that, okay, these people robbed the Brinks truck, people killed, etc., etc. Now they didn't go into the details of it. Right? But what it seems to me is just like a move to get the public, general public, to see these groups as a negative image. They won't espouse what they're doing positively. What can you do to counter that? The media.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the basic thing that all the groups that they have attempted to touch are doing is fighting for some land and independence for black people. But in the process of that fight, we have touched many different aspects of our problems, and addressed ourselves to them. I mean, like when they attack former Pampers, they're attacking people who have put shoes on babies' feet.
What I'm speaking specifically of those the media's involvement in sort of, making these groups not known to people. In other words, right now, a lot of black people, the only thing they know about the Republic of New Africa is that they're tied into a Brinks robbery.
Yeah.
2 police were killed, and they don't know the other things about it. So is there any way to counter that media blitz?
Right. Well, I guess by coming on your program and telling the truth is one of the ways we do it. But the truth of the matter is about the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa is that we have been involved in many different programs which they have attempted to conceal from the public. We have organized lunch programs around the country. We have organized programs. We fought against problems in affirmative action where the Baki campaign, many of our cadre were in the higher echelon of the Baki organizing committee, which organized against things. We've been involved in housing problems. We've been involved in just about any kind of problems that you can think of. We've established schools for children, We've been involved most primarily in organizing in the South. But what we eventually want to have is a plebiscite. And the plebiscite is a vote where black people will be able to express whether or not they want to be free of America or whether they want to remain in America, which is something we have never been asked, by the way, whether they want to remain part of the American political system or whether we want to have free and independent pieces of this land for ourselves. And so this is what the provisional government has been doing. The provisional government, just interestingly enough, is the primary factor responsible right now because, let me say this, when you move for independence, see what you're doing is dealing with the coefficient of power. In other words, you're trying to seek the empowerment of your people. That's the question that we're addressing ourselves to. And when we move for the empowerment of our people, then there's a lot of side effects of that movement which begin to give us semblances of power even before the ultimate winning of nationhood is occurred. So in the city of Detroit right now, the provisional government is the primary force, in my view, responsible for many of the black faces in the electoral system, although we have never directly participated in that system other than perhaps by some individuals voting strategically for certain candidates at certain times. The situation was one of what was called the New Bethel incident back in 1969, where police officers came and shot up Aretha Franklin's father's church. And they were shooting up the church because there was 143 workers of the provisional government meeting in the church. And to make a long story short, what happened as a result of that is that a black judge, which was one of the only 2 black judges in the city at that time, participated in the helping to free the people of the RNA who were involved in the church. And there was a case which resulted called the New Bethel trials, and they attempted to the white community galvanized to try to throw this judge out of office. His name is Crockett, George Crockett. Right now he's he's a U.S. representative. And the provisional government and others organized a Black United Front. And it galvanized black people in the city to the point where there were a number of different organizations which began to work in such a way that a number of different black officials were eventually elected into office, and a lot of the racist white officials who had preceded them were thrown out of office. And it really, a lot of it stemmed from that incident. That's one of the few jurisdictions in the country where you can get a predominantly black jury, anywhere, in the city of Detroit, and it's all from that case and from that trial. So the scuffle for power, so to speak, produces many side effects. And I think that a lot of those things have been true of the course of our history.
The program is The Family Tree, and our guest this evening is Chokwe Lumumba, the Minister of Justice for the Republic of New Africa, and he's also the Chief Counsel to the Committee to Defend the New African Freedom Fighters. He spoke this weekend, this being, the 8th weekend of the 8th, I guess.
This is the 8th. Today is the 8th.
This is a pre-tape program for you listening.
Mm-hmm.
And your topic was war in America. You hit up on some reasons why, and maybe you could take some excerpts from that topic.
Yeah, let me say this, is that war in America, we've really been talking about part of it, and I think that the Brinks incident and things preceding it as well as things after it clearly show the disposition toward warfare. But I think that to understand war in America in its proper context, we should not fail to delve back into history and understand the American system and the American government and the American state as it became into its existence and as it has maintained its existence throughout the years. Remember, of course, that America got its first breath of political life off of the savage murder of the Native American population and the stealing of the land from the Native American population. Its second breath of life, if you want to call it that, was when it enslaved millions of Africans and dropped a number of us in the Atlantic Ocean on the way over here. And that was another part of its breath of life. What it was doing, in fact, is waging war against these populations. Now, I know that white historians would have us believe that somehow these third world populations just submitted to the great American white man and somehow wanted to be enslaved or wanted their land taken and were happy to do it. But the truth of the matter is that the only way you take anybody's land is that you just run them off of it, right? And you run them off of it by brute military force. And that's exactly what the American government did. And that's the same thing that they did with the African when they snatched us off the African continent and oppressed us over here. So war in America is something which starts way back then. See, the American state itself America is in a state of war. It has always been in a state of war since it's been in this country. It moved out westward, taking land from the Chicano-Mexicano people in what they call manifest destiny. And manifest destiny, of course, is just white man takes all theory, right? And so, like, what we have under these white supremacist moves is in order to maintain the existence of America once it had been established, you couldn't just expect slaves just to be slaves, and so you adopted the type of state that was constantly in a state of war, that was constantly ready to prepare for war. Something like 200 and something slave rebellions occurred during slavery. And in order to suppress those, they had to develop a system of patrollers and all types of paramilitary groups in the South, as well as the state forces, the state National Guards themselves, which combated various different Africans as they fought, and combated the Native Americans. And interestingly enough, Native Americans and Africans united with each other on many different occasions to fight this war. During the I get these centuries confused because the same things tend to happen over and over again. But during the 1800s, in the 1860s, you had the Civil War. The Civil War was an economic confrontation between the North and the South. The South, which was in control of the economy, and the North, which wanted to get control. But the important feature of this is when we talk about the war in America is that the African person, the ex-slave or slave, reached a military truce with the Union Army, we can say, for a period of time, because it was the Union Army which eventually began to promise them freedom. And so for a period of time, we were actually fighting with the Union against the Confederates and actually helped them win the war. If we didn't, we won the war, really, if you want to look at a historical context. And then what happened is that after that, we were betrayed. We were promised land, we didn't get land, and so warfare erupted out again between us and the Union. And it erupted in terms of land rebellions, where black people just took to the street and began to fight for land that they had been promised. It erupted in terms of black people who had already consolidated communities like on the South Carolina Sea Isles and in Davis Bend, Mississippi, free black communities where white people couldn't even come, all right? When the marshals came to take this land back, black people stuck guns in their face and said, no, no, not there. And so they fought, and it was a warfare. Eventually, these communities were suppressed, but only eventually, not immediately. And so this was the war re-erupted. And when we see the so-called riots, the actual rebellions of 1919 in East St. Louis, when we see up into the 60s in Birmingham, Alabama, Harlem, 1965, Watts, 1967, Detroit, Newark, these are the ramifications of black people responding to a warfare which conquering armies have put upon them. Now, America is very sophisticated in what it does. It has reached one of the highest levels of oppressive technique of anyone in the world. And so, rather than to actually reveal the fact that they are in a state of war and waging war against oppressed people, they have put this in terms of police actions, you know, like, and so like literally police officers serve as occupying army in our communities. But at the same time as they serve as occupying army, they are said to be only police officers. Now, this particular tactic or strategy leaked just a little bit in the Vietnamese War, because remember we were told that was a police action over there, right? They were there dropping bombs on people, but at the same time it was only a police action. Well, it's the same thing in our communities. They just operate just a little bit differently. Not really all that differently, because if you look at 67 in Detroit, the same people that are fighting in Vietnam wound up fighting in the streets of Detroit. Same helmets, same guns, and everything else. But in any event, most of the time they're a little more sophisticated about it. So they put fellas out there in blue uniforms or in Brooks Brothers suits that do the same things that people do with helmets and tanks. And they use other techniques which do the same things, dope and various other things. And so this is the war in America that I was talking about. And when the Black Liberation Army begins to respond to the war, or when any of the Black Liberation Movement forces responds to the war, then they talk about the war and they call us terrorists. When in reality we're doing only what any reasonable population would do. If you're at war, then you have to participate in it or either be totally liquidated by it. And there's a real danger of that happening if our people don't wake up. The Native American population has virtually been liquidated because of the United States war upon them. There's millions of Native Americans across this country at one time. And at this point in time, I understand that there's just a little over 1 million. But we have to respond to it. Reagan is in office, and that means that the war has taken on a type of a disposition where it's going to become more and more reckless. The election of Reagan is just a symbol of the determination of American forces to deal with the question of the black man in a pretty barbaric way. They feel that their so-called democratic rituals are failing, and what they have to do now is take a more overt approach. Reagan was openly supported by the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan. Fella gets into office, his budget director gets on TV, tells you that the economy is designed for the rich to rob the poor blind, and then at the same time that Stockton says that on TV, they're going to come back and say that we're terrorists or that the people in the Brinks incident are robbers, and they're robbing millions of people across the country blind and admitting to it.
Looking at our social condition today, many people have their comforts, cars, homes, etc., and they're content, you know, with the capitalist system that we're living in. And so they might not even see a war in America. So how realistic is it to try to wage a mass war in America, and what types of struggle do you foresee? Is armed struggle, I mean, is that a realistic type of struggle here in America where maybe 90% of the people won't even see that there's a problem?
Well, I think that your figure's a bit high. Yeah, I think that 90%, let me say, I know. Let me say that if it was really 90% of the people satisfied in America, we'd be just blowing in the wind. But the truth of the matter is that I would say 90% of our people, speaking to black people, have serious problems. I mean, like in Detroit, where I come from. We have people that can't pay their rent, they can't pay their notes, and even if they can, they can't pay their gas bill to put in the house.
Even on that, I think many of those people see the solution to those problems as being the continuation of the system that we're under now.
There are some of them who do, there's increasingly more of them who do not. And I think that what we have to do is this, and I think that, and to answer your question directly, first of all, I think that there's a number of people that we're going to have to do very little with, because Reagan is doing most of it for us, right? He's doing a number of things in order to change the mentality of our people. But in addition to that, I think that what we do have to do, and what is important in this whole human dynamic that we're dealing with, is that we have to involve ourselves in a prolonged political confrontation with the enemy, which begins to exhaust the so-called legal means, which begins to in fact, focus for the people the real problem. Like when I talk to you about the provisional government of the Republic of New Africa involving itself in affirmative action fights and things of that nature, you know, some people will wonder, well, why do you do that, given what you ultimately believe in? But the reason we do that is because we will walk the lines with our brothers and sisters. We will do the strikes and do the protests because we know what they're going to come to, you know. It is necessary for us to wage a demand and raise a demand with the people, so that the people, as they get these demands thrown back toward them without being answered, will have answers, you know, to the questions. And so, like with every welfare problem, you know, with every housing problem, with every drug problem, with every police brutality problem, we're there to fight for justice and at the same time to state to the people that only land and power will solve poverty and oppression. And as we do that, you will find that there's a surprising number of persons that are responding to the call. We were in the Los Angeles area not long ago, I think it was in February, and we were having a public discussion on a public station, and a number of people called in concerning the Black Liberation Army and the whole question of land. And we got 90%, believe it or not, of people who supported the whole question of land and who supported the whole question of the Black Liberation Army. People begin to answer certain questions for themselves, begin to say things that we weren't even saying. One old sister called in and said, well, look, God bless the Black Liberation Army. I wish that some of these young brothers that's out here on the street hitting each other over the head would get in the Black Liberation Army. And I think that's one of the things that the Black Liberation Army said, too. The Black Liberation Army said is that one of their desires and one of their missions is to politicize the whole question of armed aggression and violence, to take it away from the black-on-black crime and things of that nature and to put it into the proper context. Because, see, you know, like, and let me say this about armed struggle. Yeah, you know, there's armed struggle going on. The question is, are we going to struggle with each other or are we going to struggle against the enemy, right? Okay, there's armed struggle going on even before the Black Liberation Army lifts a finger to do anything. We're struggling with arms to kill each other in many different ways because the system has put this mind-stifling, maddening oppression on us to make us attack each other. So what they're simply saying is that, like, all that energy which is being expended to destroy ourselves, let's use it to destroy the enemy. Let's use it to destroy the controls over our lives, okay? And I think that's a call that they put out in the Black and Liberation Army communique, too. Finally, let me say this, is that the struggle of black people is a political struggle, it's a diplomatic struggle, it's an international struggle, as well as it's a military struggle, it's an armed struggle. If you talk about armed struggle by itself, then it seems foolish to talk about it. If you consider everything else, it seems foolish not to talk about it, okay? And I think that the reality is that this is a mean, cruel, violent society. There's a mean, cruel, violent government. There's no way that they're going to let us have anything without fighting for it. We believe that we will fight for it and we will win it. We think that we will strategically fight for it in the Southland. We believe that the angels of God, that's what I call the Black Liberation Army, we believe that they will do certain things in various other parts of the country which will make it more plausible for us to do what we want to do. Unlike the Vietnamese now, we don't have exactly the same problems. See, the United States just bombed and bombed and bombed Vietnam, and Vietnam couldn't bomb them back, you know, like, because they didn't have any airplanes. We don't need any airplanes. We can walk to the places where we need to go and where bombs need to be laid. And that's not to say that I'm dropping any bombs for the record, right? Okay, because of course I'm functioning at a totally overground capacity, but you know, there's angels of God who do. And so, like, what we're saying is this, is that the situation of armed struggle is a very realistic phenomenon. And we're not just talking about black people, we're talking about Puerto Rican people. Puerto Ricans, independence movement on March the 1st of this year, just a few days ago, apparently a Wall Street establishment blew up in flames. And the Puerto Ricans issued a communique indicating that it was for the independence of Puerto Rico and it was an action for a Puerto Rican movement. And they entered into absolute solidarity with the freedom fighters arrested in the Brinks incident. We have a situation with Chicano, Mexicano people who There is a large group of Chicano-Mexicano people in the Midwest area and in the areas closest to the coast who are now organizing for the question of independence of the southwestern portion of the country from the place, in the reunification of it with Mexico. We support that. We believe they support our struggle. We know that they're Uncle Tom Chicanos, or what Tio Tacos they call them, and as we know that there's Uncle Tom Negroes are running around here. But that's a dying breed. Their political impact on our population is dying. The material conditions, see, like when we analyze this situation, essentially what it is the material conditions which will form the mentality as opposed to the mentality which is going to form the material condition. And the point to be made of that is this, is that in a period of time when America is stealing the wealth of the world and able to give you, and me a couple of cars, able to give us a little higher paycheck, then it's easier for them to maintain this facade. But see, they don't have that type of luxury anymore. They can't give us even gas to put in the car as opposed to the cars themselves. And that's because the Arabs are taking their oil back. The Africans are saying, oh no, they're slapping their hands in Africa, and the Latin Americans are slapping their hands. So it's becoming tough to be a world of power. And what they do is they come back and they re-exploit the old markets. They re-exploit us. They exploit the hell out of us, right? And so in Detroit, 60% of my people don't even have jobs, right? Okay, we don't have jobs in Detroit. We don't have gas. We don't have electricity that we can, and people are being, once again, you can go into black homes and you can find like 3 and 4 families living in a facility which is built for one. And so in that type of situation, I think that the American dream is being exposed to just what it is, a nightmare for black people. And that being the case, I think that we will find plenty of fertile ground for the organization of our people. What we have to do, and this is a big mission for us, is that we have to properly exploit it. We cannot be found in the closet at the time that we need to be in the street. And that's a criticism of some of the movement groups in the past. It's also true that we have to unify. We have to come together to fight our primary enemy, and then later on we'll resolve some of these other questions. There's a lot of intellectually stimulating questions which are tossed around the movement, but at this point they need to stay there in the intellectual category, and we need to be doing some concrete stuff on the streets. And I think that those are the things, and if we do these things well, then you will find that you will certainly see a real live movement in this country.
You were saying we need to do some things. Tell me, how can our listeners support the Committee to Defend the New African Freedom Fighters?
Right. The Committee to Defend the New African Freedom Fighters is the committee which is fighting for the freedom of the Brinks defendants at this time, and also which will be fighting for other freedom fighters in other places. But here in Los Angeles area, they should call 684-2266. or 234-5522. That's 234-5522 or 684-2266. I understand that the committee in the Los Angeles area is going to have rallies, they're going to have fundraisers, letter writing campaign, very important. We need people to write these soldiers, these freedom fighters who are behind jail. They've been tortured and they have been psychologically abused very severely. So I wish people would call, get their numbers and get their names, and then send them missives in the mail, send them letters in the mail.
Thank you very much for coming down to KPFK. Did you have any last remarks?
Well, I just want to say that I think that the other point, of course, is information, right? And I think that, Brother Sylvester, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak here. But it's a service not just to us in the provisional government, but I think it's a service to humanity. And I think that that's important. I hope that other communicators around the country and right here in the city of Los Angeles will take that opportunity. Thank you very much.
And we've been talking to Chokwe Lumumba. He's an attorney and also the Minister of Justice for the Republic of New Africa, and also the Chief Counsel to the Committee to Defend the New African Freedom Fighters. My name is Sylvester Rivers. The program has been The Family Tree.